Thank you for hitting the record button. Today's speaker is Dr. Michael Crane. He's with us here at Sinai in the Department of Environmental Medicine, and he directs the Selikoff Center. The Selikoff Center is for occupational health. I'm sure he'll explain what that is for those of you who don't know. They were heavily involved, they continue to be involved in the follow-up to the World Trade Center disaster, and he'll be talking about some of those subjects today. I'll hand it over to Dr. Crane. How are you?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be with you. And my assistant is here, Katie, who actually knows things and can actually do stuff like run Zoom. And I am hopeless at that. So I'm going to, every once in a while, or actually frequently, ask you to change the slides and we'll move through the lecture. And Katie, let's get started with the next slide. So we're going to talk about disasters, and we're going to talk about the response to disasters by public health personnel. And I'm going to talk about two disasters in particular, the World Trade Center disaster and the disaster at Fukushima. Now, the first shot you saw was the towers getting ready to collapse, collapsing, killing almost 3,000 people. And then you can see that enormous dust cloud that moved through the streets of New York and over into Brooklyn, and then kept on being resupplied by the fires that continued in the ruin of the World Trade Center tower due to all the fuel in the plane, the fuel in the building, and it sat and it burned for weeks. The other thing we're going to talk about is the Fukushima nuclear disaster. This was in, there's that number 11 again, March of 2011. They actually call it 3/11 as opposed to 9/11. There was an earthquake in Eastern Japan. The regional nuclear power plant on the coast of Fukushima shut down as a result. It was followed very quickly by tidal waves, a tsunami, which knocked out the cooling stations. The nuclear plant melted down. There was a release of a huge cloud of radioactive material over the surrounding countryside, and followed by an evacuation, very rapid evacuation of everybody within 20 kilometers of the place, and then workers racing in trying to control the release, and joined by first responders. Eventually 19,000 workers were there. So the next slide. So what's really important for you and me both is not just what we do at any given time, but that we actually try to learn something from it. And I'm not sure I've learned enough yet from World Trade, even though I've been at it now for 20 years, and I still make mistakes. And one of the lessons is that everybody who confronts a disaster, and even with the best equipment and best intentions and best personnel, is going to make mistakes and or have things that they try to do not turn out the way that they thought they would. So there'll be untoward consequences. So that is part of this business. That is not something for guilt or intense self-reflection about. You will fail if you're involved in disasters, but you get up and you start again and you really reanalyze and you keep going. So let's just talk about the lessons. I'm just going to recite them to you. Can we go back one slide, Katie, so we get the first one? So the first is to control access to the hazardous site, and you register the workers and the people in the population. So you know who's there and who got exposed to whatever it is. The exposure should be characterized and monitored very carefully. The dust cloud, for example. And then later on, when they were trying to figure out what was happening in the community, the dust that escaped the homes. At Fukushima, the radiation that escaped, and then radiation left behind and what that meant to people who would be in the region. And then you do an appropriate regulated cleanup, a cleanup according to standards. And the violations of those will become quite apparent to you as we go through the examples. If you're in a decision-making capacity, you must be transparent about your decision-making and transparent in your communications. And now an advertisement for myself, which is okay with Cappy, because I checked, you need trained occupational medical professionals from independent medical centers during these crises, because you will be put to the test to do something the way somebody wants it done, which may not be the way that is the best for the public health of the people. And that's the job. The next slide, Kate. And we won't take long on all of these slides, but I'm going to reiterate these lessons as we go along. Close attention to mental health these disasters have huge consequences on the mental health of the community. If you're going to do research and patient care, it should be independent of the source of the payees or of the government or of those with a vested interest in the situation. You need to be flexible in your response, listening to the people and responding to them. And then a lesson that I've learned all too many times, when you're helping a population who's been traumatized, a success, such as increased enrollment, will always bring new challenges, such as which services you have to get to them and how are you going to afford them. And then continuous outreach to the target population, using trained personnel and valid instruments to know the impact of what you're doing and the need for other types of interventions. And that goes on in many, many fields of public health, so it's not unique to this. So let's go to the next slide, Katie, and we'll just start talking about the example. So we failed at lesson number 1, World Trade. We don't know who responded and who was there. We still don't know. Today we have, even this side's a little bit behind, we have more than 80,000 workers enrolled, responders enrolled in the World Trade Center Health Responder Program. We believe that the total was about 90,000, so we're 8/9 of the way there, so it's pretty good, but we're really not sure, okay? And so that was a failure from the very beginning about not, not paying attention to a basic rule, which is to figure out who's on the site and make sure you know where they are and where they're going. The community population survivors program was estimated based on the residential population of Lower Manhattan is 400,000 people. Same thing. We don't know who those folks are anymore. To do stuff, we have to go find them, and we don't know where they are. So the survivor program is also, it's very good, but it's underutilized. So only about 30,000 people out of those 400 participate. Next slide, Katie. So we failed early. We didn't define the populations. We did a poor site control. We didn't have any roster. And then at the same time, the local authorities were engendering mistrust by failing to do basic jobs like supervise the cleaning of residential buildings. Next one, Kate, please. And not having a registry has downside. Like, for example, today, people, if they want to participate in our program for responders, have to have proof of presence, proof of who they are and what they did. And a lot of them don't have that. And so we have to put them through hurdles where they should be just walking into the program. Go ahead, next slide. So the exposure is critical. Characterize the exposure carefully and repeatedly. So the dust at World Trade, we also failed this one. So you saw the pictures of the dust cloud. Nobody knows what was in that cloud that all those people breathed and got covered with. The only thing we know is what fell to Earth, because the only way we could do it, we had no meters set up or anything. We had to go send, probably graduate students out with plastic cups out to the site afterwards to get little samples, scoop it up off the ground and bring it back to the lab. And that's what we have. Now, we found all this poisonous stuff in the dust, and yes, that was certainly in the air and certainly got into the bodies of the responders and the people in the community population. But what else was there? We don't know. So we failed, number 1. And what was there, and what was proven to be there, is pretty toxic. Lots of asbestos, cement dust, which has an alkaline pH. It's very, very irritating to the mucous membranes, metals and leads and PCBs. And then because of the fire, combustion products, benzene, polycyclical aromatic hydrocarbons, you name it, dioxins, diesel fumes. But we still don't know what was in the cloud, and we still have, what we still have is an unknown exposure. Next one. So meanwhile, over at Fukushima, after the radiation was released, they actually did a very, very good job of tracking that exposure. Radiation measurements in Japan are not uncommon. There's lots of equipment available. They were able to catch the cloud of the radiation dust and vapors as it traveled over Japan and track it very carefully. They could track what fell to Earth. They could track what was on the ground. And then very cleverly, they said, okay, what we're going to do is ask everyone to tell us where you were, and where you were going, and where you went, and how you went in traveling on these days. And we're able to map out for people during various times of the days when the cloud was overhead about what their dose of radiation was. Very, very clever. And they did an excellent job of that. Next slide, Kate. And here's just some of the mapping that went on. The one on the right hand is the position of the cloud on a given day. You see the big red dot, looks like a thunderstorm from a weather map. And then the behavior, you see that's somebody's movements then that day. And by doing that for a large number of individuals, you got to know the dosage for the population. Next slide. And it was helpful because some people didn't get exposed at all, and you could tell them so the anxiety went down. There were 2 million people in the province that were affected, and they tried to check everybody. Next slide. And they also did a bunch of other surveys. They looked at all numbers of children in the prefecture, in the region there for thyroid ultrasound and thyroid cancer. They looked at the people who had been evacuated from the immediate surroundings of Fukushima province to other provinces. They followed up with questionnaires and lifestyle information. And they also looked at pregnant women. So trying to do the health follow-up and the exposure assessment really went fairly well following this radiation event. And then they began a series of checkups. Most outstanding in all of this from Fukushima was the huge amount of psychological distress, particularly in people who had been evacuated from their homes. It stands out. It stood out at the very beginning in the initial surveys. It still stands out. It was a huge psychological blow to people to move out of their homes and to relocate. And then there were a variety of radiation measures available, whole body counts and meters. And the net result was that even for the workers, there were some small number who were very, very highly exposed. But most of them, more than 95%, did not have a life-threatening exposure or life-endangering exposure from this particular event. And the general exposure for the population was rather low, significant as compared to the usual background, but not generally in what would generally be considered health threatening. So really, there have been guidelines for radiation exposures post-accident, and most of these were met by the folks from Fukushima. And here's a question now. I'm going to skip. How shall I handle questions? Shall I wait till the end? Would that be okay?
It's your preference, whatever works best.
Okay, so why don't I hold the questions to the end, and then I'll get to all of them because I'm having a little trouble just kind of maneuvering back and forth with the screen. So great. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide, Kate. Now, people think that there is a good argument to make that the screening of children that was done for thyroid was kind of overkill. And they started a little bit too early because cancer, even in children, takes a while to develop. So there was a good bit of criticism about this. There were findings, and there were findings on follow-up. But many people felt that they created much more anxiety than they should have for literally thousands of people for a relatively small number of folks who actually were found to have a serious situation. Still debatable, still going on. I just wanted to call it out to you though. So next slide. Coming back a little bit now to our own hometown of New York, the failure to look at exposure in the surrounding community, to look at the dust in the surrounding community, to clean up in the surrounding community, was a terrible oversight by the folks in charge of New York City at that time. It was the Mayor Giuliani was accused of caving into business interests, of hurrying up to do everything to open real Wall Street and not take care of the people. The staff at the DEP who had this responsibility didn't have enough workers to go out and inspect the buildings, much less clean them. So this was another very great failure, and to this day is resented by the members of the downtown community. No cleanup. Next one. And here's the same story. And Christy Todd Whitman, who on September 18th reassured the world and the people of New York that their air is safe to breathe and their water is safe to drink, made the mistake of her career. And a lot of cynicism followed. Next slide. And meanwhile, workers were becoming ill. And here's a point where the point for trained occupational environmental professionals comes in. These folks had cough and runny nose. If they had gone to their regular doctors, they might have just been dismissed as having a virus or early flu, but they came in and told the story of their exposure. It was listened to. Mount Sinai at that time had a superb staff in the Selikoff Center, which I'm privileged now to participate in. And they wrote these cases up and reported them. And this became the basis of follow-up for the the initial New York program, and then the entire World Trade Center health program. So let's go on. Okay, and so what happened? Well, as the need grew, the research pointed to the need for a large number of programs to take care of these tens of thousands of workers, and these are the centers that are now opened. The third one, the Environmental Health Center, was opened for the survivors. That's the community people, but as I mentioned, it's sadly undersubscribed. And the World Trade Center Health Registries works in the Department of New York City Health Department. It's a combined epidemiologic study. So let's go on, Kate. So it did have response, but it took a while to get going. So after the towers came down, the doctors who saw those new patients coming through with the World Trade Center cough and the World Trade Center sinus infections very quickly said, we're going to need help. And they set up a screening program with the help of NIOSH. It was an independent program in an academic setting, which could report on what they saw and what they thought, and they could write down what they thought needed to be done. And that is another very key point for your lessons learned. Use academic, independent medical centers because they will do their best to tell you the truth. Next slide. So the people were seen in the screening program, 70% had new respiratory symptoms. There was a large increase in the number of folks who had abnormal lung findings on spirometry. The next slide. And then a screening program continued. Other private companies became involved. There was certain employee-based medical care, an excellent program at the fire department who had nearly all its members, more than 10,000 involved in the response. And finally, the World Trade Center Health Program, which was created by the Zadroga Act after lots and lots of campaigning for it, funded by the federal government, headquartered in NIOSH, and it's the program that I work for today. So a successful effort due to paying attention to the basic complaints of a few responders, the basic investigations of dust as a potential carrier of toxins, and some good follow-up and some good publication and some good independent work and reporting made all the difference in the world to the founding of the World Trade Center Health Program. And this is just the numbers for today. We have, as I mentioned to you, we have about 80 out of 90,000 responders, and a lower number, unfortunately, of the survivor population. Next. And there is something called a certification in the World Trade Center Health Program. Responders and survivors are asked questions about how and when the illnesses that they have developed in relation to the exposure, if it is just justifiable. They're told that they're found to have a World Trade Center related condition. Usually they started within a few years of the actual exposure. And these are just some of the categories. The word aerodigestive refers to the gastrointestinal tract and the respiratory tract. So those conditions are quite common. Cancer, unfortunately, has become quite common. Although many of those, more than a third of those, are skin cancers that are quite easily cured, actually, which is a very good thing. Mental health in our population is enormous as a problem. You saw about 13,000 people. And if you just look down this longer list here, you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right after sleep apnea. I apologize, it's hard to see. I think 9,000 responders have post-traumatic stress disorder. That's more than 10%. So that's a very common and very dreadful disorder that you will see repeatedly in populations that have been either rescuers or participants or victims of disaster events. Very important. Mental health is critical. And then there's various types of cancers that are found in the responders. And we can just go past this, and Katie, come back to when it's question time. So there were lots of health challenges on both sites. At World Trade Center, there was the dust and the ongoing burning. At Fukushima, there was the not only the need to be wary of exposure to radiation, but there were ongoing explosions, aftershocks, people, deprived of the company of their family members, and heat stroke was not uncommon at all. As the summer came in Japan, and the heat from the ongoing work in radiation was enormous. So again, on-site conditions developing, unexpected to some, but this is a challenge that has to be met at these disaster sites. Protect the workers from the environment that they're working in. Next slide. And this is about the radiation. In general, the radiation to the workers, thankfully, with relatively few exceptions, was rather on the low side, and in general not an amount that would be considered to be in any way threatening to their health. Next slide. And of course, on site, both at World Trade, protective gear necessary, respiratory protection equipment was dreadfully lacking at World Trade. A better effort was made for Fukushima in terms of dosimetry and a full face respirator and protective clothing, and moving people out when they had been exposed to a certain amount of radiation with the dosimetry. Next slide. So in general, I would have to say that the Fukushima response protected its workers better than the World Trade Centers at the site, even though both were just extreme emergencies. And the Japanese have studied these and followed them up. However, there's a great deal of distrust by the workers, since they did not feel at the site at times that they were treated fairly. They were, as the response went on, and it's still going on now, there was concerns about inability to get appropriate worker representation, that they were being shortchanged on wages and overworked. So a lot of unhappiness at the site. And again, this was a failure of having an independent monitor on site to represent those workers. That did not happen. That position was assumed by labor leaders down at the work site for World Trade, who repeatedly went to the Department of Health to discuss their issues, I think with a better response. Not so to my understanding with Fukushima. So protection against those on-site dangers and exposures has to be continuous, and you need to have a knowledgeable person representing and able to represent the working group. So the screening doctors, screening of funds available for World Trade ran out, but by that time, thanks to the work of Sinai physicians and other physicians, there was definite evidence and repeated evidence and published evidence of the enormous burden of physical and mental health conditions related to exposure. The next slide. And this is once again the need to have an independent, skillful, knowledgeable group of people who understand occupational health. In this country, they're typically physicians and industrial hygienists, social workers, health professionals who understand the risk of work available to you in these disasters, not only to categorize them and make the conditions known to other scientists through publications, but to aid the workers in carrying out their tasks. Again, coming back to mental health, both here in New York City and at Fukushima, repeatedly, the stressors of work in these types of environment have a tremendous impact on the workers. Here's a study from Fukushima where they looked at at PTSD. I think the next slide, Katie, is a little bit helpful here. and also follow up on even with the general population. There was a real effort to try and reach out to the population in Fukushima about their mental health conditions. Next slide. And they found an enormous rate of post-traumatic stress in those who had been picked up and evacuated out of the Fukushima site. So this is not the workers now. This is the folks who had to leave because the site was contaminated. This was very similar to the findings from the people who were experienced the Chernobyl disaster. So this was not new, that mental health is put under enormous stress by these disasters, and particularly by those involving radiation, because radiation, let's face it, is something that just creates real fear in the minds of people. So it's very important not only to categorize that, to write about that, to write publications about it, to educate other physicians and healthcare professionals about it, to educate government officials about it, but also to have the people who are doing the work independent, free of either the boss who's paying or the worker who's working. Independent look. And this is a study of police officers, and this is police officers at World Trade. And police officers, when they come in to talk to people about how their mental health is, typically don't want to talk about how bad things are, because there's an old prejudice against people with mental health in policing throughout. And police officers who admit to having a mental health problem are particularly concerned because they often have histories of other workers like that being, quote unquote, put on the desk and then losing the gun and then losing the badge. In other words, being discharged from the job because they admitted they had a history of a mental health problem. So there's a lot of fear amongst police officers dealing with mental health. And can we go back that one slide, Katie? Can you go backwards? You see here, the second paragraph, as people began to be studied. So the first wave of study, 2 to 3 years post 9/11. So there's about 7 or 8%, between 7 and 8% admitting to probable PTSD. 5 years later, that doubles, more than doubles. Okay, now they didn't all get PTSD, just because, they were doing their jobs. Most likely, they had been experiencing all along that 5 years went by and they were closer to retirement, and they felt that they could admit that they have this terrible situation happening. So independent longitudinal research where people look and understand at what's happening with the tested population is really, really important. Let's go to that next slide again. And again, this is another situation also with police officers. Okay, you don't have PTSD, that's wonderful. But Dr. Petrusek and some others with him found out that those with the subsyndromal PTSD had many other symptoms as well. Could you just go to that next slide, Katie? Because I think this continues. And if you look at the black print there, you can see that things like depression, alcohol use, somatic symptoms were highest among police with full PTSD, and intermediate rates, those who had subsyndromal PTSD. In other words, they went through the questionnaire, they didn't admit to all the symptoms, and they came in just below the checkpoint where they'd be known that they had the syndrome. And believe me, people talk about mental health tests, that they know how to play them. So, but there is a definite subsyndrome of PTSD. It doesn't quite meet all the checkoffs that you need to be called a patient. So PTSD is a dangerous condition, and it brings a lot of baggage with it, like panic and alcohol use. And you have to keep that in mind when you're looking at any patient, but particularly a patient who has a vested interest in not having you find out because they're afraid that somehow it would get reported. Very important point. Subsyndromal syndromes are something to keep in the back of your mind. PTSD is also, it's a terrible condition in general. You lose family members, it disrupts your work and social life. It seems to kind of radiate outward to the children. Next slide. So this is, this is a this is a condition that you will see again and again and again mentioned with disasters, and you really have to always think about it. Even Chernobyl, the workers who survived had very, very high rates of anxieties, disorders, suicidal ideation, and probable PTSD, even though it didn't always come out in the testing that was done. So it doesn't matter what country you're in, the disaster produces this impact on human beings. Next slide. It's also very important to remember that mental health conditions don't do well when they're left untended, and most of them are left untended. If we can just go to the slide behind this, Kate, I think the graph is there. Let's just keep going. Go to the next one, because I want to just show there. Okay, so this is delays in treatment. Okay, so this is how long it takes since your onset of disorder to get treatment. And if you look at the little highlighted text, a delay of 6 to 8 years to get treatment for mood disorders. And this is the United States of America. Okay, this is in our, in the country that's supposed to be on the leading edge of all of these things. 7 years on the average to get treatment for mental health conditions. And you have to take this into account in terms of dealing with a disaster, because here you have someone whose life, and means of making a living and maybe family members have been obliterated by this event. In the back of your mind, you have to remember, I can't wait 7 years to get this person treated, right? I have to provide something for this person now, because this delay, if it gets out of your hands at that moment, you, the person who are running the disaster, you may not get them back to treatment for all of this time, even in a wealthy country. So it's very, very important to follow up the folks who've been impacted by the disaster, and if at all possible, get them to treatment. And the consequences of delayed treatment are terrible. Marital violence and loss of job, and just misery in life. Next slide. So the idea, of course, from World Trade Center onward was to get people aware of this, get them knowledgeable about the ill effects of the disaster, the need for care. Next slide, please. So public education camps were done. There was signs all over the subways saying even heroes need to talk. And the idea was to lower the stigma and get people into care. Next slide. Let's check the next one, Kate, please. And charities also got into it. The Robin Hood Foundation did a lot of excellent work with both providers and people in the community. Next slide. But nevertheless, even out in 2013, this is now more than a decade after the 9/11 attacks, it was very well documented that many people had not at all in any way either met or resolved their mental health issues or received treatment for them. So the unmet needs were enormous. And I think the estimates are on the next slide. For downtown, it was in the tens of thousands of people in the community population. And if the rates had been applied to Fukushima, it would have been also hundreds of thousands. And it was also tens of thousands in World Trade, even though there was a problem available because we have 90,000 responders and 400,000 survivors. So it's always there. It's always too big for any program you have to handle. And you just have to keep on moving forward and working on it and trying to expand the available resource. It can be extremely frustrating. Cancer risk, yes, there were cancer risks from World Trade. I'm just looking at the firefighter slide here, which is the very well done study where you have about a 19.19 increase. That is, just below statistical significance. But since that time, other studies, including our own, have demonstrated a small increase in the extent of cancer, statistically significant, but something like if just for example, if there's a if there was a cancer that had should be at the level of 100 patients in our entire World Trade population, there would be something in general like about a 10% increase in that. So, and instead of 100 patients with the cancer out of 80,000, you'd have 110 patients with the cancer in 80,000. Thus, the 10% increase in disease, but not a huge numerical increase in the cancer because the cancer rates themselves are rare. So yes, elevated cancer risk, but not enormous. Next one. And this is just another study, a couple of studies of our program demonstrating a small but significant increase, 9%. Next one. And this, oh, well, this one is actually the one that I'm going to, when I'm about to enter heaven, I'm going to bang on the door and hold this one up. So hopefully they'll let me in. This demonstrates that World Trade Center program participants had lower cancer mortality compared with regular folks in New York State who got cancer, that there seemed to be survival benefits to cancer victims in the World Trade Center program. So the hard work, this one says that the hard work you do sometimes really does pay off by giving you the opportunity to see that you've saved lives, which is an enormous thing to feel and wonderful for the patients. But good intentions could also have a downside to this. Like I said, in a disaster, things may not work out the way you think. At Fukushima, they were very, very insistent on their evacuation. They pulled people out of their homes. They removed individuals from nursing homes. In this particular study, 50 elder patients out of 840 who were evacuated died from dehydration or hypothermia from the evacuation. And that's a very, very high and unfortunate mortality rate, and a sad unintended consequences of the disaster response. Next slide. There's a quote from Dr. Tom Farley from the New York City Health Commissioner talking about evacuation. And he said it was better to say safe than sorry. In other words, get the people out, but there's often no safe option. This is a very, very tricky place to be when you have to pull people out of where they live and move them, particularly elderly people, particularly vulnerable people. And it can have a tragic end, as it did in Fukushima. Let's go to the next slide. Later on, years later in Fukushima, people had returned. There was still low-dose radiation exposure, but still the lasting, most significant, most outstanding issue was the marked psychological distress that was in the population. It was greater than 3 to 4-fold more prevalent, and lifestyle-related conditions. So psychological distress remains a predominant and prevalent concern after both disasters, many, many years after they've passed us by. Next slide. This is more about sheltering in place and evacuation, so we can just go past this. And again, people are back at Fukushima now living. So I think that the recommendations that came out of both disasters are similar. Excellent communications regarding what is happening with the population, feedback to the residents, risk communication, using epidemiologists that are independent and reputable, who will tell the truth and publish it and allow others to see their work and critique it. The next slide. It just gets back to our lessons here that you need to control the site, characterize the exposures, regulate the cleanup, be transparent, publish your work, get it out there so others can say you're wrong or you're right, or I can really use this. Use trained environmental and medical professionals. Next slide. The mental health consequences, you will see this everywhere in the disaster literature. That's because it is absolutely correct. The mental health consequences of the of these events are enormous and life-changing, and they must be heeded. Independent researchers, a flexible response to trauma, listen to people, change your plans where you have to. Know that any success you have will bring new challenges, and continue that outreach to the target population, trying to figure out what's happening with them and stay current with their needs. Is there one more slide, please? And then, yes, we'll take questions. That, of course, is the anniversary lights that are the memorial of the two downed towers. So I think we stop there, and I am delighted to take questions if I can see them, and we'll just see where we go. So thank you very much. How do I get to the questions now?
Well, I can read them out to you. Let's see what we have.
Sure.
That might work. So we had a question when you were talking about the questionnaires for the Fukushima population. Do you know how they were able to distribute the questionnaires to people if they were evacuated?
So they actually they went to the evacuation sites and made sure people got the questionnaire. They were very, very forward. Obviously, they couldn't mail them, right? So they actually got them out to the sites. They had workers going out to the sites regularly, and they really, really pushed the pedal to the metal in getting this, trying to get this these surveys out in front of folks. They knew that they would learn a lot, and they knew that they were very frightened. I mean, rightfully frightened about what was happening with the population. So the survey was really a very strong effort. I don't have, I have not seen the published statistics on why people didn't return or any comments like that. But they did the effort to get it out was strong.
Great. Our next question is, have you ever had to personally testify on behalf of 9/11 victims?
Oh, yes. Yes. Many times, as a group and as individuals, yes. There's various types of hearings. Some of them, for example, also file workers' compensation cases for some of these lung injuries they had. And yes, I've stood up many times, and I will continue to stand up. It is an honor.
Can you tell us a little bit about that experience? Like, what is it like to tell these stories to people who may not be as friendly to the stories as you would like?
Well, I'll tell you about a time I went to give a lecture to a group of, I think it was a group of insurance professionals in Dallas, Texas, of all places. So insurance professionals are not, the warmest hearts when you're talking about disasters, because they're on the other side and they're paying, and their boss has to pay. And I think it's not unfair to say that they might be a little bit more cynical than the average person about the histories of injuries and so forth, particularly if they deal with a lot of workers' compensation or other types of injuries. You're always hearing about insurance fraud. And so I talked to these folks, and believe me, I'm not particularly eloquent. I'm about as eloquent as I am right now, which means I'm always stumbling over my words and stopping and seeking the right word, and having pauses and hesitations. And when I finished, I couldn't see because it's pretty dark. I just showed pretty much the same slides. It was dead silence. I said, "Oh my God, they all left. They all left. Oh God, I blew it." And gradually I heard this applause. And they gave me a standing ovation. People were coming up to me, hugging me. It was unbelievable. It was unbelievable. And wherever I've gone with this, people pretty much say, even the lawyers who are trying to grill me to admit I'm an nincompoop and I make stuff up, shake my hand and tell me thank me for my service. So it's usually it's always mixed, but it's often an underlying sense that we did the right thing with this program.
Right.
And I think people still believe that. So it's been, for my money, it's been the most rewarding work of my life.
Next,
Did that answer the question? Was that?
I think
that-
so.
Okay, cool.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for asking it. Thank you so much.
Our next question, as the population of World Trade Center survivors and first responders ages, what might the future of the WTC program look like? And this person says, I attended the event that Sinai held on the 20th anniversary, and I remember them talking about cognitive impairment as a concern.
Oh, that's so great. And thank you very much. And thank you also for attending. That was really nice of you. We really appreciate it. It's a very great concern, for a number of reasons. For one thing, there's some relationship between future cognitive impairment and the experience of PTSD. Now, that is often, in research that I'm aware of, been kind of mixed up with like traumatic events where there might have been head trauma as well. But even when there wasn't, PTSD and cognitive issues seem to be related as people age. I think it's a significant finding, a significant fact that we need to be paying attention to and monitoring the people extremely closely. And that type of monitoring has started, for the subtle changes, possibly using the MoCA questionnaire or other surveys of impairment. So we'll be looking at it as we go along in the next 20 years. I think the other thing, though, that's really important is that workers from World Trade are likely to have more than one World Trade Center related condition, plus non-World Trade Center conditions, high blood pressure, heart disease or whatever, in addition to asthma and PTSD and sinus problems. And it's been shown that people with multimorbidities also may be at risk, not only for cognitive issues, but for what's called frailty, the syndrome where people become, weak and lose energy and can't walk well and don't have good grip strength and start to just kind of involute in general, give up. So that's a very great concern because we have many of them. And again, we have actually received a research grant from NIOSH to look at frailty, which will also shade into cognition. So it's a great question. I really appreciate your interest in us, and I encourage it. And we will be looking at these things very carefully. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Dr. Crane.
Thank you.
Sorry, I have another question. How do you adapt to the changing site in the World Trade Center? How do you adapt to a changing World Trade Center?
So great question. And let me just provide a little bit of interpretation, my spin on it. So it went from, the site went from these tall gleaming buildings suddenly to this pile of burning toxic mess, and then rebuilding. I think the site for some people, particularly for those who worked there previously before the attack, is very difficult to be near. Some of our patients tell us who were responders, I can't go into Lower Manhattan still, and they have real difficulty. So the site itself is a source of some significant stress for some of the population.
Wow, so some of them must have that trauma even from 20 years ago.
Oh, yes. Oh,
Even
yes.
though
Yes, it has a remarkable life, PTSD, and it is easy to think, oh, I'm over it. I'm over it. I'm okay. I'm fine now. But for example, many of our patients had a reactivation of symptoms when the building in Florida fell down, the one where it collapsed all of a sudden and people were killed. Many of our patients sort of started to relive their experience again. And it's always there. It doesn't ever completely leave you, from at least from my experience.
We have another question. You mentioned that we had no way to measure airborne particles when 9/11 happened, which is why we had to measure what fell to the ground. Does New York City have the appropriate monitoring set up now to take those measurements if needed?
So whoever asked that question, I'm going to hire them right after this. It's a great question. I don't think we still have it. I mean, so what's definitely improved is communications, right? So one of the terrible problems, horrible, was that police and fire couldn't communicate with each other. So they couldn't give the warning successfully to get out of the building to the folks who were in there. And so unnecessary loss of life. That's communications have definitely improved. But I'm not sure still we have the type of monitors that would be necessary in an event like this, readily available to make them useful at the time. So it's a great question. Cappy, he or she should get a big red gold star, okay? It's something, that will signify super question.
Got it. Any other questions from the audience?
So you said that like Rudy Giuliani catered to like the business interest.
Oh, I can't imagine a politician doing that. Can you? I mean, my goodness.
I thought I was like, oh, Rudy Giuliani is not the innocent hero that they portray him out to be.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was Rudy in particular. I think it was a whole bunch of people, both in Washington and Albany and New York, who wanted to get the stock market going again because they wanted to show that America is on its feet and get back to work and all of this stuff. And I think it was a patriotic intent, but out of that patriotic intent, people just derived the wrong lesson. You can get back to work and still measure the dust in people's apartments. You can get back to work and protect the workers. One doesn't exclude the other. So it was kind of
like you can walk and chew gum at the same time, basically.
I think you speak very well. That's perfect. I would say you got it.
Sorry about that.
Thank you for the question. It was a great one. Thank you.
I have one other question if there's nothing else from the audience. So you had mentioned not just PTSD, but mental health issues in general, which tend to be underreported. And you mentioned how that's even true in our city, in our country. And you mentioned how there is data showing change over time in the positivity of these types of screens. Do you see optimism in terms of a better acceptance and understanding of mental health issues? Not just in the face of a disaster the magnitude of 9/11, but everyday life can be traumatic in meaningful ways. Has that changed much in terms of our acceptance of PTSD as a meaningful problem that we can talk about?
Yeah, Cappy, it's a wonderful question, and I think it really, it hits right at the core of where we've just been. I think one of the things that's really happened from all the information about the healthcare workers fighting for people's lives and then having a really hard time, I think that's awakened a lot of people to the reality of mental health conditions, not as some type of sign of weakness, but as something that occurs in heroes when they're being heroic. And so I am actually more optimistic about mental health care than I have been in the last 20 years. And all of that is due to the heroism and sacrifice of our colleagues and all those who work with them and their families, who stepped up, stepped in line, risked their lives, are feeling the impact of it now. But I think the knowledge that they've been so open about their issues has really helped. So I'm optimistic, believe it or not.
And I wonder if the global trauma of the pandemic has also brought positive attention to mental health, as we've essentially all been suffering from extra stressors.
I would certainly agree. I would certainly agree. As I always say, Cappy, if I have it, it can't be all that bad or something.
That's a positive mantra to live by. Okay, anything else that folks want to ask before we wrap up? If not, we can end a little bit early today. Thanks so much to Dr. Crane for sharing his professional experiences and interpretations of this important subject. Thank you so much, Dr. Crane. Hope to
Pleasure.
see you sooner than next year.
Thank you.
Take care now. Nice seeing you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.